In 1878, the assistant sexton at St. Mark's Church in the Bowery stumbled upon some fresh dirt in the graveyard and decided to do some investigating. And what he found started one of the most bizarre manhunts that has ever hit New York City. Viewer discretion is advised. Let's get into today's story. Alexander Turney Stewart, or A.T. Stewart, moved to New York from Ireland in 1823 when he was 20 years old. He had a religious upbringing, but Stewart abandoned the idea of becoming a Presbyterian minister, which was his original plan in life, in order to travel to America. Using money left behind for him by his grandfather who had passed, he built one of the most popular dry goods stores of all time on September 1st, 1823. A.T. Stewart & Company might not be a store that people know about today, but this store was a major success. He clearly knew what he was doing. Stewart would undersell his competitors and attract customers from every direction. This was basically Walmart way before Walmart. He also figured that people would be willing to travel for the best price instead of burying himself in Pearl Street with all of his other competitors. When he first opened this store, he would dump goods onto the sidewalk in front of his store in order to attract customers. People would see the things available and they would go into the store. This is basically how window shopping started. He knew a lot about business and it showed. He didn't waste any store space or money on advertising the store's first 8 years. And still, he was the most popular store in town. His thought process was if people wanted to find his store, they'd figure it out on their own. He figured word of mouth was his best tool at his disposal. And the store he started in was very small. We're talking 12.5 feet wide and 30 feet deep. That's it. He rented this space at 283 Broadway, which was right across from City Hall Park, and he did so for $375 for the year. By 1848, he had created A.T. Stewart's Marble Palace, a much larger store that took up an entire city block, and that would propel him into the American elite. The building was just on the opposite side of Broadway from the original store, and it was the first New York City commercial building to use Italianate architecture. The building actually survives today at 280 Broadway. In fact, it's also known as the Sun Building today. At this point, Stewart was the most successful retailer in the country. He had bested Lord & Taylor, Macy's, and the other big guns of the era. In fact, to this day, he is one of the 10 wealthiest Americans of all time, having a net worth somewhere around $90 billion today. But his story gets more interesting after he died. A.T. Stewart died on April 10th, 1876. He was buried in the churchyard of St. Mark's Church in the Bowery, which is located in today's East Village. What upset a lot of people was how his money was used after he died. After all, this man was loaded. But in his will, he left no money to any charity in the city, no university either, and he had become somewhat of a curmudgeon by the end of his life, firing people for stupid reasons, taking petty revenge on people who had wronged him. In fact, for those of you familiar with the fictional character Ebenezer Scrooge from Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, there are many similarities between their personalities. Needless to say, people liked him a lot more earlier in his career than later. Stewart's widow, Cornelia, used some of his remaining money to erect several buildings in the town of Garden City on Long Island. Stewart had been establishing this land to create housing for his employees at a moderate cost, because one thing that was important to him was taking care of his employees. In fact, he had 6 employees that started with him in 1836 that were still with the company by the time he died, meaning they had been with him for 40 years. And to these employees, he left each of them the equivalent of $7 million in his will. But after his death, Cornelia saw to it that the land in Garden City received a school and a church. The school was St. Paul's School, which to my knowledge is still there in Garden City, but has been under the gun as far as potential demolition is concerned. The church, however, is the Cathedral of the Incarnation, the seat of the Episcopal Diocese of Long Island. It is the only cathedral in the United States funded by a single person, and the only one built in memory of a single individual. Now, the plan was to move A.T. Stewart's body to this cathedral when the mausoleum was completed. They'd remove his body from St. Mark's Church in the Bowery and take it out to Long Island. This kind of thing happens all the time, whether you're aware of it or not. However, the plan changed on November 7th, 1878. That morning, a man named Frank Parker, who was the assistant sexton of St. Mark's Church in the Bowery, began his work shift by walking around the premises. Right away, he noticed that there was a poor stench in the air, although in 1878, anything on the streets could have caused a foul smell. When he took his stroll through the cemetery, though, something caught his eye. He noticed that there was a pile of dirt in the grass, and this was fresh dirt. It hadn't been there the day before. A.T. Stewart's flat tombstone didn't seem like it had been tampered with, but something was making Frank feel uneasy. He knew he wasn't going to be able to sleep that night unless he did some further digging, literally. So he enlisted the help of some clergymen, and together they lifted the heavy gravestone of A.T. Stewart. Now they had this big dark hole in the ground, unable to see to the bottom, and so Frank attached himself to a rope and was lowered into the hole. Again, he just had to be sure that everything was okay. After all, this was one of the richest men in America when he died. When he got to the bottom, what he found shocked him. Well, actually, what he didn't find shocked him. The grave was missing an engraved silver nameplate, but more importantly, the body it identified was also missing. A.T. Stewart's remains were gone. And then Frank realized something. That smell wafting through his nostrils in this hole in the ground was identical to the one he observed while on his morning walkabout. When he was raised from the hole in the ground, he noticed a line of gag-worthy stains across the stone porch of the church that continued to the iron fence. And then when he looked up at the fence, several pieces of rotting flesh limped over the spikes. Disgusting, right? You've got to remember, this body has been dead for over 2.5 years, and Stewart was not embalmed. Investigators would also find an old copy of the New York Herald, a shovel, a lamp, a wooden board, and a woman's stocking. So what the heck happened here? Well, clearly, A.T. Stewart's grave had been robbed. Grave robbery wasn't particularly uncommon in the 19th century, as I'm sure many of you will remember from our Doctors' Riot video, which I will link in the description below. The economy is bad, and this is a rich man who didn't give away any of his money, so were these grave robbers looking for a payday? That was the working theory, but they'd have to wait it out. In the meantime, let's investigate. The weather from the previous night was able to help them narrow down their time window a little bit. The previous night, it rained, so in theory, this New York Herald should have been wet, but it wasn't, except for maybe a few pages. You see, the assumption here was the investigators thought maybe whoever committed this act used the pages from the New York Herald to dry off their hands after digging in the mud. But this could only be done after the rain stopped, which was around 3 o'clock in the morning. Eyewitnesses claimed that there had been a parked wagon across the street at the time, and that wagon disappeared by 3:30 in the morning. So now the question was, where did they take this body? Remember, it stinks. So odds are, if the body had been taken anywhere in the city, there'd be plenty of people who would complain about the stench. So odds are the body was removed from the city. Here's something else that was interesting. This body was due to be transferred very soon. Knowledge not really available to the public. The church would have this information, though. So was it possible that this was some sort of inside job? Each person at the church was given a thorough search and questioning, but every single person had an alibi and could not be linked to the crime. They had hit a dead end with their investigation. They didn't know who had the body. They didn't know what they wanted with the body. One possibility was to study A.T. Stewart's brain. But was he really a genius, or did he just have a nice string of good luck come his way? After all, he wasn't like these other multimillionaires of the time that made money in real estate. He made his money in retail. Ransom seemed far more likely. Cornelia worked with Stewart's executor, Judge Henry Hilton, to take out an ad in the paper to offer a $25,000 reward to anyone with information regarding the body's whereabouts. Now, of course, everybody wants a piece of that action. So information comes from every which direction, but what can you really trust? There was one instance where someone wrote into the New York Herald that the body would be returned if and only if Cornelia Stewart donated $500,000 to literally any charity. But with no proof that they had the body, she didn't do that. Two men named William Burke and Henry Vreeland told authorities that they knew where the body was and they would show detectives where it was. But after realizing they'd be arrested instead of being given a reward, they stopped cooperating. The area was swept anyway, but no sign of A.T. Stewart's body. And by Christmas time, so not even 2 months later, the public stopped caring. No more newspaper space was being dedicated to this. Very few people were still talking about it. Then in January, something interesting happened. The postmaster of New York received a letter from a man claiming to have the body and was interested in an attorney and a negotiator. The alleged kidnapper would be interested in the postmaster filling these roles. When the postmaster asked for proof, the missing nameplate was sent to the postmaster. This seemed like a major break in the case. The postmaster would pass that information along to Judge Hilton, who instead accused the postmaster of conspiracy. And so once again, nothing happened. Now this went on for years. Mrs. Stewart had no answers. She died in 1886 and was laid to rest at the Cathedral of the Incarnation in Garden City. The following year, the former police chief who had covered this case published his memoirs. And in these memoirs, he made a claim that had never been presented to the public before. He stated that in 1884, so 2 years before Cornelia Stewart died, she had reached out to these supposed robbers, the ones who had sent the nameplate. She allegedly offered $20,000 for closure. The robbers sent her a map of the Hudson Valley, and then one night, Cornelia sent her nephew to this map location where masked men dumped a bag of bones in the road after counting the money. Those bones were taken to the Cathedral of the Incarnation, very discreetly, and then placed in the mausoleum meant for the married couple. So in theory, Cornelia might be resting alongside her husband's remains again. It's also possible that she's buried next to a collection of bones that are unassociated with A.T. Stewart at all. It's also possible that she's just by herself and the police chief made it all up to put an end to this investigation, being that anyone who cared about it was dead. There are many people who believe that this body was never actually recovered and that the people who did it got away with it. Supposedly, though, if you get anywhere near that coffin of A.T. Stewart at the cathedral today, the bells in the church are triggered in an alarm-like ringing to ensure that his remains can never be taken again. So that's going to do it, everybody. What do you think? Is he there? Is he not there? Make sure to comment below. Feel free to comment New York City stories that you'd like to learn more about as well. I'll be writing up some new scripts very soon, and will gladly take your suggestions into consideration. Also, please make sure to like and subscribe. Again, I'm Mike, the NYC Storyteller. Thanks for stopping by today, and until next time, deuces, kids.